All right. Good to go, Jeff. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to make this full screen and start right ahead. So my name is Jeff Allen, and I'm a PhD student in geography at the University of Toronto. And I typically do research on urban geography and transportation planning. But aside from that, I also kind of work sporadically on freelance cartography projects, both kind of maps for print and the web, depending on the project. But what I wanted to present today actually stems from a couple kind of like hobby or passion projects that I was working on over the past year, especially during free time during the lockdown, which is the topic of fantasy transit maps, which are a type of map that's set at the intersection of transit maps and fantasy maps, both of which have been talked about a little bit at this conference. So first, transit maps. Transit maps are maps of public transit networks, and they're often designed for wayfinding or broader understanding of kind of like network connections and coverage. Early transit maps, like this one for London from 1908, were designed particularly to be geographically accurate, typically superimposed over kind of like an at-scale city map. And historically, these designs were actually built upon styles of regional rail maps and stuff from the 19th century. During the 20th century, transit maps became much more schematic, focusing on topological connections rather than specifically geographic accuracy. This is one of the earliest maps of such, probably the most well-known to design based on topology, Harry Beck's 1933 map of London. And almost all public transit agencies now develop maps of their routes and networks. Today, topological maps tend to be used for rapid transit or rail, like the one on the left for Montreal, while more geographic representations are usually the standard for maps of local bus routes, like on the right for Thunder Bay. So fantasy maps. I think my favorite definition for a fantasy map is that they are maps of places that are a departure from consensus reality. But the scale of that departure can vary in range to, from low fantasy based on some deviation of the existing world to kind of like higher fantasy, otherworldly kind of places. For the latter, when one thinks of fantasy maps, it's usually what comes to mind are kind of like pre-modern or medieval, often magical worlds like Tolkien's Middle Earth, which is probably the most well-known fantasy map. But of course, it doesn't have to be of this type. Actually, a longtime hobby of mine is to create and draw fantasy maps of somewhat realistic modern cities. This is a screenshot of a map I made of maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think, but I still of a completely fictional place. And then there are fantasy maps that fit within the existing world, but exist within some alternative reality. So this can either be like, geographically, like this map of Sodor, which is the fictional island situated between England and Ireland, which is home to the wonderful Thomas the Tank Engine. And they can also be kind of either temporal or historical departures from reality. So this is a map of Gilead, which is the alternate timeline for the United States in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. So what then are fantasy transit maps? So these are maps of public transit networks that are a departure from consensus reality. And so a common form of fantasy transit maps are transit networks that do not exist, but are based on some sort of expansion or alteration of existing conditions. And so the term fantasy in this sense usually pertains to, what could be, plausibly given certain political ambition or investment in public transit service. So this is the earliest known map. I know of this in Canada, at least, which is from 1910, a proposal for rapid transit in Toronto that never came to fruition in the following couple decades. This is another map also of Toronto from 1945. The north-south line on this map was built about 10, 12 years later, but the east-west lines were never built. But increasingly, these kind of fantasy maps have become, very much visionary tools in political campaigns and government promotion. So this is the current Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, standing in front of his party's proposed or fantasy transit map from a couple years ago. And each election cycle, each local election cycle, it's almost become expected that kind of budding politicians create fantasy transit maps that attempt to balance something that looks, visionary and forward thinking, but also like graphically simple, but also can be realistically funded and constructed. So there's certainly a balance at play here. Now, in a similar vein, but in a way a bit opposite, are maps by amateur or hobbyist map makers. Rather, people like myself that create maps that are much more on the side of like visionary, idealistic, quixotic, or even highly implausible end of the spectrum. So this is a map that I made during my free time over a couple weeks, about a month or so ago. And it's not just necessarily about proposing transit, but also about, different forays into cartographic design that may not be able to do as part of like a client project, for example. So for this one, I included a little pictographic legend that was inspired by, actually inspired by old ordnance survey maps, which have a similar kind of legends themselves, which is actually, in this case, a micro fantasy transit map on its own on a map of a fantasy transit map. And pretty much every city that I've seen, or of a certain scale, has residents making fantasy transit maps, especially in Canada, where public transit is often lackluster, and people, definitely want to see improvement in the system. So this is a map that somebody else made that I found actually just yesterday when I was putting this together for this expansion of the SkyTrain in Vancouver that was posted on Reddit recently. This is another one for the metro system in Halifax, of what one would potentially be look like. Actually, I like the black background on this map. And then these maps can also exist at even like a higher level or at a continental scale. So this is a map I made a couple of years ago of completely implausible high-speed rail network across North America. But while, certainly a departure from reality, all of these fantasy transit maps that I've shown thus far still stem from real world conditions, based on the motivation or idea that transit service within or between cities should be improved. But there's also lots of, or maybe not lots, but some transit maps of completely fictional places, which are equally awesome, I think. This is a subway map from the Grand Theft Auto video game series, which was mentioned earlier today, in the fictional Liberty City, which is actually a scaled down resemblance of New York City. So it might actually be that more people in the world have looked at this transit map than a transit map of a specific town. This is a completely imaginary city and its transit map that actually a train driver in Australia made as a hobby project. An article was posted in Wired a number of years ago, but I think these are just kind of awesome designs and thought process that's been put into these. And then lastly, this is an example of a fantasy transit map that someone created about an already fantasy world, like something out of Inception or something. Specifically, though, it's a public transit map of George R.R. Martin's Westeros, maybe like 2,000 years into the future after the setting of that story. So this was supposed to be a lightning talk, so that's all I prepared. I'm currently trying to bring this jumble of ideas and categorizations into a short essay. But thank you for listening today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. That was awesome. I love transit maps, so I was looking forward to your talk. I lived near Halifax, so the one that you showed from Halifax is interesting. Yeah, that's super cool. Thank you. And the Westeros one too. It's too. Yeah, that one.
Yeah. That stuff's not my work, but I thought it's just really cool. So it's nice to show as well.
Yeah, I even made one of New Brunswick because I live in that province now. And anyway, it's not as nearly as complex as the maps that you made yourself.
Oh, I would still want to see
it.
Yeah, I'm trying to build up a small collection of them, and then I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I just like to collect maps, even if it's digitally. But
there you go. I'll just send it to you for your collection.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions, but if anybody has any, you're welcome to leave them in the chat for Jeff for him to answer.
Yeah, I have my email and I have a website up here if anybody wants to contact me as well. I don't know if that's findable elsewhere on the conference site.
Okay. Byron said we have some extra time for questions. Jeff Maps, I'm going to visit your sites later. No. Yeah, the Westeros map is interesting. Westeros is already a fantasy world, and then they're adding another layer of fantasy world, and also how you added the political aspects of fantasy metro maps with Doug Ford and the expansion of the TTC. So that's definitely another dimension of that.
Yeah, the last election cycle here in Toronto, I mean, there's 3 or 4 candidates, and each one of them had a specific map with a slightly different plan on it, but all pretty similar. But
yeah. Christopher Lee, other than train maps, do you create another fantasy transit maps of buses, LRT, streetcars, or others?
So one of my hobbies is to create kind of just fantasy urban maps. And so sometimes there's, as part of that, like I had a screenshot of one of them. I'll include like rail or bike lanes or multiple kinds of transportation into one kind of an overall kind of map of a place that doesn't really exist in the world. And then Byron wanted to see the other one, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so this was the map that I made for Toronto about a month or two ago, but based on real world conditions. But if the city had some sort of exorbitant amount of money, which obviously isn't going to happen, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've traveled in other cities around the world. I'm thinking about Madrid or Paris, where they have, or even Shanghai, they have an extensive metro system, and then I go back to Toronto and they have 2 or 3 lines.
Mm-hmm.
So
and and then an extra one with only 4 or 5 stations.
Yeah, right. Byron asks, how much would that cost? A lot.
Oh, billions of dollars, I think, and it would go probably way over budget. But I don't want to be so pessimistic there.
Well, we'll have to start putting our shovels in the ground. All right, I think that's it for your presentation, Jeff. That was super cool. Thank you so much for your time.